Okay, welcome back. There is really one more topic we should talk about here before we sort of dive into our content, and that is the notion of argument. So, arguments are going to be very important for us. They are, in many ways, sort of the stuff that philosophy is built out of. They are sort of the engine of philosophy. And if you remember from last time, I was sort of comparing or contrasting the philosopher's use of arguments to or with the scientist's use of sensory evidence. Right? Scientist answers scientific questions by turning to evidence and experiment. The philosopher answers philosophical questions by turning to arguments. Right? Arguments coupled with intuitions that, at least sort of canonically, play the role of starting assumptions. Right? Arguments are nice, but of course they don't. they always start somewhere, right? They always rest on some first principles or some starting assumptions or some premises. And so the argument is only as good as the premises, but nevertheless, sometimes when you buy into the premises, the conclusions can be very compelling. And that's sort of the way that we want to think about philosophy proceeding. Right? This is the way that we want to think about philosophers coming to have opinions about, coming to have beliefs about unseen things. Right? If the questions of philosophy have to deal with unseen things that are not sort of connected to sensory perception, right? Then we need to have some non-sensory way of forming beliefs about those things, and arguments are going to be the key to that. So let's just make a few notes here. Roughly speaking, we're going to be talking about a certain kind of argument called a deductive argument. Okay. Now, the idea here of a deductive argument is the following. Well, first of all, let's say something about what an argument is. We started looking at these last time, but just very roughly, I'm going to say that an argument is a set of claims such that one is privileged as the conclusion of the argument, and the rest are premises, starting assumptions of the argument. Okay. Just for the sake of simplicity, we'll assume, at least for now, that an argument will have exactly one conclusion and at least one premise. A lot of toy examples that you look at will have two premises, and those are certainly very common. Sometimes there will be more, but here is sort of a worn-out old example that lots of people use in philosophy. Socrates is a man. Okay, we'll number our steps here just so we know what we're looking at and can speak with some precision here. Premise 2, all men are mortal. Therefore, notice the use of the word therefore here to indicate the conclusion, which of these claims is in fact the conclusion. And probably you can guess what the conclusion is going to be. Well, if I know that Socrates is a man and I know that all men are mortal, it would seem to follow by logical necessity, more on that in a minute, that Socrates is mortal. Okay. Now here's where I was just saying before about deductive arguments, where what I was saying there is relevant now. The idea of this sort of structure of an argument is that the premises should make the conclusion, let's put it like this, logically inescapable. Right? That is, if I've accepted the premises, so if I accept as true, even if only for the sake of argument, right, that Socrates is a man and that all men are mortal, right, this is sort of the power of argument. I mean, it's nothing terribly revealing or surprising in this particular case, but nevertheless, right, those two commitments that I've made, those two, as we might say, doxastic commitments, commitments to beliefs that I've made to line 1 and to line 2, compel me logically also to accept line 3, that Socrates is mortal. Right? And the idea is, if I didn't accept this, right? If I didn't accept that Socrates were mortal, right? Then I would be contradicting myself. Right? Because I seem to believe both that Socrates is a man and that all men are mortal. If Socrates isn't mortal, he would be an exception to this general principle saying that all men are mortal. And so I can't very well believe both that all men are mortal and that Socrates isn't, given that I also believe that Socrates is one of those men, all of whom I claim in my belief to be mortal. So this is what we're looking for in a good argument. And we're going to call an argument, when it's successful in this way, valid. Okay, so an argument is valid when. So there are a couple ways you can put this. We can talk about logical inescapability. We can talk about possibility. It might be most helpful to think about what is conceivable or imaginable. Okay, so let's put it like this. Is my argument valid? Okay. That's my question. Answer. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Right? This is partly why imagination is so important in philosophy. Can you imagine, let's just say a world, right? No matter how crazy, right? It can be crazy. It just has to be possible. Right? It just has to be imaginable. I can imagine a world with, that's only the Earth exists and it's covered in spaghetti sauce instead of, the oceans, and there's no life on it except for, 2 ants, and the ants have developed English, and they're talking about the end of the world, right? That's a mind-boggling, crazy picture of what a world might be, but it's consistent, right? I can imagine it. It's logically possible. Okay. Can I imagine a world where, right? Several things. I guess I've been calling it my arguments, premises are true, and let's put it like this. My argument's premises are true, and my argument's conclusion is false. Okay, capital M's, why not? Can you imagine a world where my argument's premises are true and my argument's conclusion is false? Okay. And the idea of this Socrates argument up here is that no, right? I cannot imagine that. I cannot imagine a world where it's true that all men are mortal, it's true that Socrates is a man, and yet false that Socrates is mortal. Right? I mean, I can say those things, but I'm not really imagining it, right? Because after all, am I imagining that Socrates is mortal, or am I imagining that he's not? Right? Well, the first 2 premises, in effect, promise that I am imagining Socrates to be mortal. But then if I turn around and say that this conclusion is false, then I'm trying simultaneously to imagine that he's not. Right? I can't imagine that Socrates both is mortal and is not mortal. That's not possible. Okay? And so, if I have an argument that's like that, right, can I imagine a world where my argument's premise is true and my argument's conclusion is false? This is typical of philosophy, where the answer to a question is just another question. But let's clarify what we mean here. If so, the argument is invalid. If not, the argument is valid. Okay? That's the test, right? That is the test of validity. Can I imagine that the premises are true and the conclusion false? It doesn't have to be in the world as we understand it to be. It might be some very strange world. But in any world where the premises are true, must the conclusion also be true? That's the question. Okay? If so, you've got a valid argument. If not, then you don't. And this is basically the sort of argument that we're aiming for pretty much all the time in philosophy. Right? This might be sort of a new concept for you. Not all arguments are like this. Maybe the nearest thing that you've had exposure to is the sort of argument that you make in math class. Right? If you've taken geometry and had to sort of outline proofs, that's really the same sort of thing, right? I'm using principles, I'm applying my example to those principles, I'm drawing conclusions. That's the same sort of structure that we're talking about here. Right? If I prove that the angles of a triangle are equal to 180 degrees, right, I'm going to start with certain assumptions about, parallel lines and right angles and, and all that sort of stuff. Maybe the 5 axioms of Euclid's geometry, something like that. And with the help of some further definitions, I can, in effect, deduce, right, by means of this deductive argumentation, all the theorems of Euclidean geometry. That's the power of this sort of argument, right? And moreover, the theorems that I deduce in this way are, right, just by definition of the type of argument that we're talking about here, they are ironclad. They are logically inescapable. They are, right, guaranteed by logic, by the definitions of my terms, by the axioms I've started with. Okay. That's pretty cool. Now, the goal in philosophy is not to, generate facts about triangles and so on. It's to try to generate facts about other sorts of things, right? What are those philosophical topics? Well, we talked a little bit about that in previous lectures. We might be addressing questions about the nature of God. We might be addressing questions about ethics. Is it wrong to lie always? We might be addressing questions about the nature of knowledge or the nature of other things. And by using that nomenclature of the nature of a thing, right, I'm trying to ask something about, what it is in itself or something like that. And that is something to do with concepts, something to do that's not scientific, right? I'm not asking about, I'm not asking about who has knowledge or where I can find it. I'm asking about what its nature is, right? What is the concept of knowledge about? We'll explore that one in particular in a little bit. But that's the idea, okay? So this is what we mean by arguments and by valid arguments. You have in your Canvas course, you have a sheet about valid arguments. So let's take a look at that now. I don't want to go through all of these, but here is valid or invalid. Okay. Let's just pick one like this one right here. On the right side, premise number 1, if he wants to join us, he will. Premise 2, he won't join us. Conclusion, therefore, he doesn't want to join us. Okay. So think about this one for a minute. Is this valid or not? Right? Is this valid or not? And remember, what I'm really asking is, can you imagine a world where the premises are true and yet the conclusion is false? Okay. So I want to imagine that it's true that if he wants to join us, he will. I want to imagine that it's also true that he won't join us. Notice that this is the negation of the second part of this complex claim up here. And if he wants to join us, he will, but he won't. Okay? therefore he must not want to join us. And in fact, I can see that that argument is indeed valid. Right? It is valid. If I imagine that it's true that if he wants to join us, he will, and that he won't join us, right? Well, it must also be true then that he doesn't want to join us, because after all, if he did want to join us by premise 1, he would. And yet by premise 2, he won't. Right? So on pain of logical contradiction, I must therefore accept this claim that he doesn't want to join us, given my commitments to the first 2 lines. Okay? Let's contrast that with this next one below it here. Premise 1, if Greg can't stand the heat, he should get out of the kitchen. 2, Greg can stand the heat, therefore, conclusion marker, it's not the case that Greg should get out of the kitchen. Okay. Now here, it looks like this argument is actually invalid. Okay. Can I imagine that the premises are true and the conclusion false? I say, yes, I can actually. I'm supposed to imagine that it's true that if I can't stand the heat, I should get out of the kitchen. Okay. And it's also true that I can stand the heat. Okay. Does it therefore follow that it's not the case? Can I imagine the negation of this, right? Can I imagine that despite these things, nevertheless, I should get out of the kitchen? Right? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, that could be true, right? It could be true that I should get out of the kitchen. That is, this conclusion might be false. Right? Notice that I'm just sort of eliminating this it's not the case that bit. Right? If I'm imagining that the conclusion is false and the conclusion has this it's not the case that bit at the front of it, then to imagine such a thing to be false is just to imagine that whatever is negated by that phrase is true. In this case, namely, that Greg should get out of the kitchen. So I'm trying to imagine that that's true, even though these premises are true. And there's no contradiction there. There's no problem imagining that. Right? So it may be true that if I can't stand the heat, I should get out of the kitchen. And it may be true that I can stand the heat. Nevertheless, it may still be true that I should get out of the kitchen. Maybe because, I don't know, maybe because there's some emergency outside that I need to attend to. Right? So maybe it's hot in the kitchen, and if I can't stand it, I should get out. I can stand it. Nevertheless, I should still leave the kitchen because there's something else more important to do. Right? No contradiction there, no problem imagining that. Okay? So in this case, this argument is invalid. Notice also the structure here. Premise 2, Greg can stand the heat. That is the negation of this first part of this if-then statement here. Right? I'm saying if Greg cannot, and then saying, but Greg can. And I'm saying that with this sort of structure, there is no conclusion that follows. There is no validly drawn conclusion here. Contrast that with this case up here. Here, this negation here is a negation of the second part of this if statement. And when I have that structure, I do get a valid conclusion. That's the negation of the first part. Okay? So we can write down some of our findings here. So let's just take a look at that for a second. Just want to write down a couple things here. Examples. Okay, so the structure that we just saw, we saw 2 arguments with different structures. The first one had a structure like this. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. Okay, and this one we determined was valid. Okay, the second one we looked at had a structure something like this: if A then B, not A, therefore not B. Okay, and this one we determined was actually invalid. So be careful, right? If we're not careful with our A's and our B's, or our P's and our Q's, our nots and our therefores, our ifs and our thens, we can get confused, right? So this is why, yet more evidence that we have to be very careful and as plain as we can when we're trying to write out these arguments, um, because the details are going to matter. Right? I move some things around a little bit, and I go from a valid argument to an invalid argument. Right? We want to try to stay in the realm of valid arguments if we can, at least when we're making them. Sometimes, the point of philosophy is not just to make arguments, but also to critique other people's arguments. And so beware of invalid arguments in the work of other people. Right? Look for invalidities in other people's arguments. You may come across them. They may be more numerous than you might imagine. Okay, great. I think that's enough for now. Good luck with the rest of those arguments on that sheet. And that is it for week 1 stuff. We will turn to ancient philosophy next. All right, thanks everybody.